we all know that history is skewed, right? Well, now we're going to dip into the lost history of Tennessee whiskey. Stick around.
Welcome to the Whiskey Showman Podcast.
All right, guys, we talked about it. Told you it was going to happen, right? I got the book, The Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey by Drew Hannush. And I started dipping into this book and I realized, dang, there's a lot of stuff there. There's a lot of stuff we need to get into. And I had reached out to everybody about doing a book club. Well, guess what? That's what this is. This is part one of said book club. If you like this type of content, great. If not, there'll be others. This isn't just for everybody, you know what I mean? So just understand that I'm trying to do different new content and try something else. Why not, right? It's my show. I can do it. I did put it out to you guys and I didn't have very good responses either way. So I'm going to do what I want to do. How about that? Some people didn't even know I was doing it. Some people were, well, I had one person say they didn't want to do it, which that's fine. But I had more people say, yeah, that sounds cool. So I'm doing it. I hope so, because I've already put a lot of work, time, and energy into this, and I hope that it goes well. So let's get into it. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping, but there's not really much to say. It's just, it's getting hot. It's life, you know, things are happening. But yeah, let's do a little, what do I have for transition? Why do I always pick that one? I don't know. Okay. I got some really good news. Went to the doctor the other day. Both doctors, actually. I have a natural pathology doctor and a oncology doctor. Went to both of them and they both said, I'm trying to get out of the way. It's okay. Full transparency. Before I get into my story, I am recording this Monday morning. It is Memorial Day. I do have to go work for a little bit. I gotta go fix something real fast, but I'm recording this early in the morning, rising to the street, light me up a cigarette, strap shoes on my feet. I'm going to get copyrighted for that because that was spot on. Anyway, and so I just wanted to give a special shout out or thoughts and prayers to all of the people who lost their life fighting for this world. This U.S., you know, all the soldiers who lost the battle. Yeah, I don't know why that's making me, it's making me feel away too. But I always talk, I don't talk crap, but like I always, try not to get political and I try not to say things. But like, I really do love this country. I love everything about this country. And the fact that people would put down their lives so I can have the freedoms to come to you during this podcast, it's like that's a huge deal, and I think we take it very lightly. I think we take it as a day where we get to drink some beer and eat some barbecue or hamburgers or whatever. I don't know if that's, I mean, obviously that's not the right way to look at it, but people are going to do people things, and this is a sick and twisted world, and they are who they are. So prayers and memories to all the fallen. Anyway, getting back to my story. So I went to the doctor, oncologist, and the naturopath. And my numbers, so after or during, when you are going through cancerous things, they check markers with your blood work, right? So they check these specific markers, go back to last episode's, I think Lost Balls is one of, I don't even remember what number it was. I talked a little bit more about this. Maybe. If I didn't, it's a recap. So everybody has markers for certain things. Like, when you get tested by the doctor, high cholesterol or something like that, they can check it, right? And so they say, hey, well, just quit eating so much carbs, right? Or whatever, So I've been doing the long work. I've been doing the hard the hard work ever since I was diagnosed. And even before, I was trying to eat super clean, no processed, no blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? I'm not a Cheeto head, right? One of those. So went to the doctor and they checked this one specific marker, which is for testicular cancer. It's LDH, if I'm not LHD, LDH. Anyway, I don't know. It's an acid that's in your body, and you want it between these certain markers. And those on the Patreon, they're going to see I'm holding my hands up. I don't know how much the marker is. But I was always like, okay, I'll give you this background. We're going to get into the book. I promise, guys. I'll give you this background. When I had a tumorous mass, and went to the doctor, my levels were well over 550. Once I had the mass removed, it was at 290, 300, something like that. And then all during chemo, that's what they were monitoring to get it down to, they want it sub 225, because I think you just have this acid in your body, and it's always present. But when I went today, it was, or not today, I didn't go today, it was like last week. When I went, it was right at 200, which was perfect. That's the lowest. That is the lowest it has ever been. And the range, the good range, like the range it should be in, is under 225. So I knocked that out of the park. So I'm not saying I have room to grow. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the stuff that I'm doing is working. Amen. Okay. So move on to the naturopath doctor, which those two people, the oncology and naturopath doctor, they don't get along. We'll just say that. Western and Eastern medicines, there's a reason there's a dividing line there, right? One person says that that's just crap, and the other one says that's just big pharma. So, I mean, yes, both. I mean, there's lines for both, you know? So, went to the naturopath, and she said, hey, no, this is amazing, because you have to think, when you're going through all of these health issues and you're doing everything in your power, right? You're doing everything you can to not die. Yeah. I mean, that's it. You're doing everything you can do to not die. So you restrict your diet, you take all these supplements, you do all these things, right? And during chemo, and even after, for a while, my number would drop 1 point every time I went to the doctor. 1 point. And I went this time and it dropped over 20, 25 even. Pretty amazing. Well, it's the stuff I'm doing with naturopath that is helping me. And if y'all want a whole episode on naturopath, I can do that as well. It's everything I'm doing in naturopath that is making oncology visits so much easier. So much easier. And so much better. So I say all that to say this. Do the hard work, because it will pay off. And the only thing that I ever asked for was another day, right? Another day on this earth. So that's all we ask for, right? And that's all we get. So I will tell you this. I have notes. Yes, I do. I printed them out because I can't read my own handwriting. I have notes on every chapter. Yeah, I went ham. And then I have questions to ask you. Now, what we're going to do, this is going to be obviously a recorded episode. I'm thinking on the next one, which I think I'm only going to have 2 parts. On the next one, I might do it live. Might. And then that way I can ask you guys these questions. You can answer them in the chat. Does that make sense? I feel like that would be a little more, full transparency. I've never done a book club, never been part of a book club. I don't even read books. I have books. I thumb through them. I'm looking for something. I have a bunch of books. You can't see it. It's right behind my back. I'm moving everything around behind my head. We're gonna have a new studio look. Anyway, but when I picked up this book, the Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey, this is over 400 pages of whiskey knowledge. So let's get into it. So full transparency again. I did reach out to Drew Hannush, and let's just say the next episode will be my interview with said Drew Hannush. Really excited about that. It was an excellent talk. That man is a wealth of knowledge, not only with Tennessee whiskey, but with everything. World-renowned author. I don't know how he came on and why he came on, but he did. And I appreciate it. So what I'm going to do to preface this book, I'm going to have Drew himself read you the preface of this book. So I will tell you, it's early in the morning. I'm having some coffee in the shed. It is 78 degrees in the shed this morning. Just understand that. Cheers. So I like my coffee like I like my women. Sweet and creamy and whatever. That's weird. Anyway, so if I can get the thing to work, which I should, I am a grown baby man, so I should be able to figure this out. Now, again, full transparency, I am not do these book clubs all the time. I don't know if I'll do another. I mean, you guys are it's going to be up to y'all. So, and I need true feedback from everybody, because if this is, I don't want to put the time, money, and energy in this if it's going to be a frivolous thing, because I had to not only read the book with the words, thumb through it. I didn't read it, but I have it on Audible as well. So while I'm working, I'm reading the book as well, or listening to the book. I listened to it at 2 times speed. I did. Okay. So for this, we're going to do the first 10 chapters. Okay. I listened to the first 10 chapters on 2 times speed, and then I went back and listened to it again on 1 time speed. You'll figure out why in a little bit. Okay. All right. So let's get into the preface. I'm going to mute myself and Drew will take over. This is right at 15 minutes. So just understand that. The Patreon, if you're looking at me in the background, I'm gonna be sipping my coffee and listening along with you. So, and I might interject every once in a while. I don't know. I might not. I might just let it roll. And so listen to the soothing sounds of Drew.
I dedicate this book to my dad for his stories and giving me a love of history, to my mom for helping me look into the hearts of people, and to Alan and Colleen for their unfailing support, and also to Cal for inspiring me and changing my perspective on life. Your courage, grace, and ability to rise above make you legendary. Preface. What is Tennessee whiskey? Well, if you asked me that question in 2018, I would have said Jack Daniels and George Dickel. If you asked me what makes those different from bourbon, I couldn't have told you. If you ask me what bourbon is, I would say American whiskey distilled in Kentucky using limestone filtered water. Naming brands would be easy. There are hundreds. The lack of awareness of the differences between bourbon and Tennessee whiskey is no accident. Since Prohibition, Kentucky has produced millions of gallons of bourbon and spent millions of dollars promoting it. When historians talk about American whiskey, they talk about it from a Kentucky bourbon perspective. In fact, Kentucky bourbon is so dominant that distillery tours have to remind you that bourbon is a distinctive product of the United States, not just Kentucky. As for Tennessee whiskey, it was several years after Prohibition before Jack Daniels became the first brand to return. It took another 2 decades before George Dickel returned, and the full return of Tennessee whiskey is a recent occurrence. It's not a surprise that I didn't realize the spirit had a history. So when I decided to learn about American whiskey, naturally my instinct was to go to Kentucky. As I plotted out my personal whiskey education tour, I put 17 Kentucky distilleries on my schedule. The only reason I put Jack Daniels and George Dickel on my agenda was because Tennessee was on the way home. The Kentucky tour was great. I enjoyed the whiskey tastings and learning what made each distillery's process unique. But what really stood out were all the stories, history, and lore. And it wasn't just the history of the distillery. Most tour guides paid homage to the evolution of bourbon as well. Obviously, whiskey-loving Kentuckians are born with bourbon pride. But when I crossed into Tennessee and got down to George Dickel, I enjoyed the tour, but the history confused me. From what I was hearing, it was possible that George Dickel never saw his own distillery. They weren't even sure if the bronze statue bust outside was an accurate representation of him. They said very little about the legacy of Tennessee whiskey. And I headed off to Lynchburg and the Jack Daniels distillery. From a whiskey history standpoint, it was the exact opposite of George Dickel. There was so much history and lore, and the small-town distillery feel was so charming, it became my favorite tour of the entire trip. However, It was all Jack Daniels history with no focus on the state. And that left me with the impression that there were only 2 professional whiskey distilleries in the state's history. So when it came time for me to expand my whiskey knowledge, I didn't give Tennessee a second thought. Instead, I headed off to Scotland. There were so many brilliant stories there that I returned home and launched my whiskey storytelling podcast, Whiskey Lore Stories. This led to another Kentucky trip. From that came my book, Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing Kentucky Bourbon. Again, Tennessee was nowhere in my plans. Ireland was my next destination. I had my plans all set for April 2020. Of course, the pandemic hit and put an end to that plan. Like everybody else, I had to sit and wait to renew my life's journey. New headline, Finding Tennessee. With my Kentucky book launched and no way to get overseas, I started thinking more about Tennessee. Over the winter, I heard the names of a couple other brands of Tennessee whiskey beyond Jack and George. I did a Google map search, and to my surprise, I found 20 additional distilleries I didn't even know existed. I plotted out a trip across the state with 19 distilleries on a 10-day schedule. I started in the eastern part of the state at Tennessee Hills Distillery. Built in a pre-Civil War salt house, I learned about the building and the historic town of Jonesboro while talking to Stephen, the owner. But we didn't cover the state's distilling history. Then I went to the Lost State Distillery in Bristol, where I toured and learned about their charcoal mellowing process and a bit of history. Then I asked about their whiskey Shelby's Reserve and where it got its name. Apparently, Evan Shelby made whiskey in the area in the 1770s and held the distinction of being Tennessee's first distiller. Well, this was just the kind of information I was looking for. For the rest of the journey, I struggled to find anything beyond each distillery's own recent history. Still, there was a comfort in the coziness of these Tennessee distilleries. I was meeting founders and distillers, something I didn't experience in Kentucky. I felt like I was watching an industry reemerge. But reemerge from what? Then I caught an episode of Jack Daniel's Around the Barrel podcast. The guest was Jack Daniel's historian, Nelson Eddy. I didn't even realize a position like distillery historian existed. The host, Lucas, was focusing on the history of Jack Daniel's bottle shape, but it was a side conversation that really drew me in. Nelson talked about a shootout in the streets of Nashville that led to Tennessee Prohibition 10 years before the rest of the country. It piqued my curiosity. I decided to interview founders who seemed to have a sense of Tennessee's distilling past. My first visit was with Andy Nelson of Nelson's Greenbrier in Nashville. He told me how he and his brother had stumbled upon the story of their ancestor, Charles Nelson, who was the largest distiller in the state in the 19th century. The next day, I was in Lynchburg, having a fascinating conversation with Nelson Eddy about the Nashville shootout, Jack Daniel's lore, and the distillery's first master distiller nearest Green. I couldn't get enough. Over the next 2 years, I dug into the story of Tennessee Prohibition and the Lincoln County process and tried to understand the story of George Dickel. I found other characters like the wholesaler turned distiller J.W. Kelly, and I was finding the more recent history fascinating too. For the longest time, there were only 3 counties in the state open to distilling. Chattanooga Distillery had to fight to get the laws changed so they could distill in their own hometown. But everything I was learning on my own. There were no comprehensive books on Tennessee whiskey history. I thought about writing a book myself, but a history book is a large undertaking that requires deep research. I continued to collect bits and pieces of information, but turned my attention to writing a Tennessee distillery travel guide instead. Then during a trip to Company Distilling at Thompson Station in the fall of 2022, I met the distillery's founder, Heath Clark. Now, Heath is someone I've long wanted to talk to. His desire to open a distillery led him to draft legislation that ignited the current Tennessee whiskey boom. I asked him about those early days and told him about my Tennessee whiskey history book project. When I told him I had put the project on ice to work on a travel book, he urged me to press forward with the history book. In that instant, I committed all of my energies to this project. My travel habits changed immediately. Instead of traveling to distilleries, I was heading to local, state, and national archives. Newspapers became my friend as I started looking for contemporary articles of distillers and distilleries. I began shaping chapters, which quickly expanded from 10 to 30. And the more I dug in, the more I found Tennessee whiskey's past rich with stories. What I was learning wasn't just shaping Tennessee's whiskey history, it was reshaping my understanding of American whiskey history. It's been a long journey of rabbit holes and revisions, I prepared over 600 pages of notes for this book. Deciding which stories to cut was a difficult process. I decided to avoid lore and only included stories supported by facts. The resulting work is the most complete picture of the area's amazing 250-year distilling history produced to date. I hope it's as enlightening for you as the research material was for me. Just keep a few things in mind while you listen. Prepare to have your knowledge of American whiskey history challenged in this work. As I mentioned before, much of American whiskey history comes from a Kentucky Bourbon perspective. It also relies too heavily on the Scots-Irish and Whiskey Rebellion narratives. As you read this book, new heroes, villains, and legends will emerge. It won't be long before you realize Tennessee played a bigger role in the early days of distilling than history has led you to believe. Also, know that the modern rules of Tennessee whiskey only came about in 2013. These are similar to bourbon's rules with the additional step of charcoal mellowing. This leads to the conclusion that Tennessee whiskey is simply an altered version of bourbon, a mindset that has caused Tennessee's distilling legacy to be minimized. As you'll learn, in the 19th century, Tennessee and Kentucky were strong competitors, and competitors look for an edge. It's time to let go of the modern rules and assumptions and learn how Tennessee's whiskey and distillers set themselves apart. Also, don't be too concerned with firsts. Marketing departments are obsessed with saying something is the first or the best. Early distillers were just doing a chore. They didn't care if they were first. So few records exist of their activities. Most of their processes evolved over time. Meanwhile, the best is a matter of taste. While marketing departments are the reason products became known, they're also a barrier to learning the genuine history of the spirit. As you'll discover, 19th century marketing is filled with fables. Some of those fables have survived into the modern age because they were the easiest records to access. In researching this book, know that I approached every marketer's claim with the skepticism they deserve. While I fall into the trap of firsts occasionally, I've done my best to avoid those claims. Another thing to keep in mind is the relationship between personal titles, distillery names, and the people who actually did the work. Ask a current master distiller what they do day in and day out. It might surprise you to find out they really don't distill. Some are ambassadors, some are production directors, and in small to medium-sized distilleries, they may take on more of a hands-on approach. It was the same in the past. We assume that because they named a distillery after an individual, that means he did the distilling. In reality, Tennessee and Kentucky whiskeys were just as likely to be distilled by enslaved workers as by the man whose name adorned the business. Before whiskey became an industry, distilling was a hearth skill usually performed by women. Yet we rarely mention their names in whiskey history. It's a problem that any historian worth their salt would love to see remedied. But if those distillers weren't documented then, it's hard to document them now. So as you read these pages, remember the forgotten souls that were the glue that held this industry together and helped it grow. And know, too, that the early part of this book will focus heavily on the state's history and tavern culture. To understand distillers, we have to understand the spirit of the state that they lived in, the culture and obstacles they faced. Distillers will weave in and out early on, but will become a primary focus as the book progresses. Occasionally, we'll take an unexpected turn into a seemingly unrelated story, but trust me, the story will add value to your knowledge of Tennessee whiskey or whiskey in general. Just one more thing. Don't get confused by the alternate spellings of whiskey if you're reading along in the book. Before the 20th century, the spelling of the word was a matter of taste. The Scottish have been one of the few cultures to remain faithful to a single spelling for almost 300 years. In Tennessee, prior to Prohibition, an overwhelming majority of writers spelled whiskey without an E. I'll continue that tradition unless a brand consistently spells it with an E. With any Prohibition or past Prohibition whiskey, I will use the E unless a brand like George Dickel spells it the old way. And now, it's time to dive into Tennessee whiskey history. And by the end, I think you'll agree that Tennessee whiskey history is fascinating and has been hidden for far too long.
All right, guys, that's it. So I will tell you this about Drew. That man, I don't know, just something about his voice. You're just like, what? You're just like a little drawn in. And the way that he oh, how do I say this? The way that he makes the chapter go. It's unlike anything. I'm not going to say I'm not a learned reader, right? But I've read some books, right, or Audible or whatever, and it's all about how you set up the chapters, right? It's all about how keeping the engagement of the chapters, and obviously this being a history book, history can sometimes be very boring, right? It's 1812, 14, 16, 18, 19, a lot of numbers, a lot of people's names, right? Where you're like, I don't even know who that person, I don't even know who that is, right? So it's really cool that Drew comes in there and he's like, he gives you a backstory to the actual book and to the actual, he puts the set and setting into it so you can actually put yourself in that time frame. So all that being said, we are almost 30 minutes in already. All that being said, let's get into the book. Now, I'm going to breeze through this pretty fast. So I don't know how long it's going to take. So I wrote down notes to each chapter. And then we can just kind of get into that. It is kind of the beginning, like he was saying, is setting up the tavern culture. It's setting up a lot of the history, the old history, from when Tennessee wasn't even a thing. There wasn't even Tennessee there. It wasn't even called Tennessee. It was called North Carolina or whatever. You know, it's like, it's so cool that the records that he was able to find showed ABC. You know what I mean? And the fact that there was a lot of because we're talking pre-Revolutionary War, stuff like that. No, 17, yeah. Anyway, maybe right after Revolutionary War, right? To where, and so this was untamed territory they were going into, aka Indian or native, native territory. So going into that territory, that's their land. Obviously, and not to get into that type of history book, but when Christopher Columbus came over and found the United States, there was already people here. So he didn't find new land; he just found more land. Hey, there was people here. So I don't know why he's like, oh, I found this new land that nobody's been to, and I'm like, no, you haven't. There's natives all over the place, and this has been their land for however long. So just understand that these natives are like, no, we're not giving you our land. Like, what? And so what do? Like true bullies, we took it by force. And that's not in this book, and that's my opinion. So I don't want to jade you on that. All right, let's get into it. Chapter 1, A Forgotten Past. This sets the stage for the journey into Tennessee, how it's overlooked whiskey legacy. It challenges the dominant narrative that Jack Daniels is the sole history represented. Understand that. And it introduces the concept of lost distilleries and erased contributions, especially from the marginalized groups. So back in the day, obviously, we're talking very early on, there was farm distilleries. If you had a farm, you had a distillery because you had leftover grain. And you would say, like if you were going into the new frontier that wasn't colonized yet, and you and your family or whoever were going out there and you were going to stake your claim on land, well, a lot of people would put up what they call a mercantile, which would be like a general store, right? And they would sell their wares, and they would have people from the community who moved there with them close by would come bring eggs, and they'd come bring, I killed a deer. Here's some deer meat, here's some sausage or whatever that they made. And they also had a lot of grain for flour and stuff like that, wheat and all that. Well, back in the day, they just had a still in the back because they had leftover grain, and they didn't have huge grain silos, and they would spoil, or the rats would eat them, or, things like that. So they would distill it to keep it, so they wouldn't go bad. And then they would use that as medicine. Okay. But the way that they distilled was a lot different than the way we distill now. They would normally do one distillation. That's it. One distillation. So when the distillate came off, it was hot and fiery, right? So they would proof it down quite a bit, and they were good at distilling, and they would only put them in oak barrels if they were transporting them. Normally, it would sit in demijohns or something like that, and they would just dip from it. It was clear whiskey. And sometimes it wasn't whiskey. Sometimes it was sugar, or it was made out of fruit or brandies. And apple brandy was huge back then because it came over from other countries, right? And there was abundance of apples and pears. And we've talked to multiple people that have said that. So that just kind of, there's all these distilleries that are dotted throughout Tennessee's history that were a blip. That's all they were, was a blip. And back then, they didn't have very much government regulation for things like that. So you could just have a distillery. No big deal, right? And most of the time, and this is, you can say we do it in a different way now, but most of the time it was the servants that would work on the still and make the mashes and stuff like that. It wasn't so much the owner of the property, like he was saying, even with the distilleries, right? It wasn't Jack Daniels out there making whiskey, right? It was Nearest. Okay. Chapter 2. I'm sorry. I'm going off on tangents, and I hope that's okay, because history is sorted, right? Chapter 2, the first still. Discusses the origins of distilling in Tennessee, dating back to settlers in the late 1700s. It covers the influence of the Scotch-Irish immigrants and early American frontier culture. Okay, so you got to think, these immigrants that came over, they were Scotch-Irish. Okay, they were leaving a place that they didn't want to be. But what was their whiskey preferences over there? Think about late 1700s. 1780, 1790, right? They drink Scotch, obviously, or Irish, right? But even back then, a lot of the Scotch and Irish was eau de vie or aquavite, right? It was a clear spirit that they made. And that's why, this gets into Scotch history. That's why they would put heather, the plant, in their distillate, because it flavored it. It made it almost like a gin. Similar. It's not, but it made it like that. Anyway, so it was like a smoky eau de vie or aquavite. Anyway, and it highlighted how distilling was integral in surviving in the economy. So they would have these mercantiles, and they would had their still in the back, and people, when they were passing by, either, hey, I'm in this town, but I have to pass by here to get to wherever they're going, the bigger city, to get more supplies, right? So when they would pass by, they'd be like, hey, dude, remember that whiskey you had last time I was here? And people drink whiskey just, it wasn't a big deal. Now there's a lot of, oh man, I don't know how to say it. There's a lot of mystique around whiskey right now. You know what I mean? Where it's like, oh, it's a fine vintage. No, they drank whiskey because, I'm going to say it like this. It was hard living back then. It was hard living. So they drank whiskey just to knock the edge off, if that makes sense. And they used it for medicine. They really did. Like if their stomach was hurting or something like that, because you have to think about it. They didn't have a lot of refrigeration or any refrigeration. They didn't have, they didn't have electricity to heat things up. So they were heating stuff on a fire. You understand? So they would use it to help get rid of dysentery and, whatever. Moving on. So they were just surviving, right? They were surviving. But then when they would go past these mercantiles, and it goes a lot into that in these first couple of chapters, they would go and they would be like, hey, I really like that whiskey that you made. Do you have any more? And you just carried a hip flask with you. That's why they call it a hip flask. And you would just go, and they had their demijohn, and they would fill it up. Well, it wasn't until a little bit later when they would put it in those oak casks just to store it, because they were running out of space and people were liking it. Well, then they realized they liked the fact that it was sitting in a barrel because it gave it flavor as well. Keep going. Chapter 3. This is where we get introduced to the Lincoln County legacy. This focuses on the development of whiskey making in Lincoln County, including the origins of the Lincoln County process, or charcoal filtering, or what is the word he used? Leaching. It challenges the assumptions about who first used the process and how it became a standard. Okay, so I'm going to say this. I'm going to have a little coffee first, but I'm going to say this. Okay. I will be the first to say, and once you listen to the podcast with Drew, you'll see me eat my words. Okay. And I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to eat my words because I have always poo-pooed Tennessee whiskey. I have, because I thought it as subpar Kentucky whiskey. I'm not going to lie. I did, because the whiskey I was drinking from Tennessee was not great. And I'm like, well, then none of it's good. But then you get people and you get past the stigma. And this is in life as well. You get past the stigma of, I don't like this because of this. Well, okay, that's fine. But have you tried this? Have you tried this? Have you tried Nelson Greenbrier? Have you tried, all these other... Just because you don't like Jack Old Number 7 doesn't mean you don't like Jack, right? Just because you don't like George Dickel, their basic 86 proofer, doesn't mean you're not going to like a special offering that they have, right? Okay. So I think just putting your prejudice aside for a second and like saying, okay, I'm going to go into this with a open mind and look at the whiskey for what it is. Because as you guys well know, and a great representation of that, and this will get way later in the book, a great representation of that is Old Dominick, right? They are producing fantastic Tennessee whiskey. Good Lord, I cannot talk this morning. I'm sorry, guys. I promise I'm not drinking. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm not drinking. They are producing some amazing Tennessee whiskey, right? And had you not told me that it was Tennessee whiskey, I wouldn't think it would be. It's just the edges are a little bit softer, That's not bad. And it'll tell us later in the book that Kentucky was doing the same dang thing. They really were. They were charcoal mellowing their whiskeys too. They just couldn't call it the Lincoln County process. Just understand that. So whiskey in general has changed. Pre-prohibition. Let's talk about that for a second. I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Yeah. But pre-prohibition whiskey was way different than after prohibition whiskey. Everything changed after prohibition. For the better, I don't know. Obviously it made it what it is now, which I feel is good somewhat. But it also put a lot of legality and a lot of restraint to these distillers and a lot of taxes and a lot of, So back in the day, it was a wild, wild west, literally the wild, wild west of distilling. And so you just did what you wanted. And it also talks in here, and this might be, There was one story. I don't know if it was chapter 2. I think it might have been chapter 2, where he was talking about the Susquehanna Indian and how they had all this corn. And see, distillers didn't use corn; they used wheat or rye or malt. So it was a malt whiskey. It wasn't until they realized that the natives were using corn in everything. And they were like, oh, this gives it a different profile when they mashed it and distilled it. They're like, oh, this is much different, right? We'll get into it. But it's really interesting to see how before you just got what you got. You know what I mean? And it's like on moonshiners, right? They would add sugar to it. They would add leftover fruit. They would add whatever. And it was natural yeast. It wasn't like store-bought Fleischmann's yeast, right? It was natural yeast. So the fermentation could be not great, or it could be really good. It just depends. All right. Chapter 4. Yeah, we're already on chapter 4. The slave distillers. This brings to light the crucial role of enslaved people in the development of Tennessee whiskey. It profiles individuals like Nearest Green, who trained Jack Daniels. It emphasized how contributions were often uncredited and erased from history. And I'm going to talk about this for one split second, and then we'll move on. It is sad. Okay. Man, it's hard. It's hard to talk about some of these touchy subjects because I don't know enough about anything to put my 2 cents in, right? So I don't want to say something and then somebody tell me that I'm not saying the right thing. But enslaved people, and they weren't just talking about African American enslaved people. They were talking about enslaved Scotch Irish as well. These people were enslaved as well. So, and a lot of people don't understand that. That's some untold history as well. The slaves were not just African American. They were Indian, or excuse me, they were native. I'm sorry, I keep saying that. I'm old school. I'm sorry. They were native. They were the Scotch Irish that it came over. They were Canadian. Yeah. Because you think about Canada, what are they? They're native as well. A different type, right? But when they came down, because they were seeing what the hustle and bustle was about in America, they enslaved them as well. And I'm not, again, it's Memorial Day. I don't want to poo-poo America, but we came in like a wrecking ball to the Americas, and we just basically wrecked shop, and we set up and we did our thing. And so anybody in front of us, we were going to demolish them because guess what? We had the backing of Europe, or, UK. We had the backing of the UK. So nobody was going to mess with us. So it kind of sucks. So the enslaved people that were working for these distilleries, like Nearest Green and people like that, they did it because it was their job. They put heart into it because that was it. Nearest was an amazing distiller, doing it his way. And the thing was, he charcoal filtered over sugar maple because it was abundant. The sugar maple was there. And he said, oh, if we do it like this, make charcoal out of the sugar maple and then filter our whiskey through it, then it's going to make it taste better. Because you got to think, the way that they distilled back then was one and done. And it was like 150 gallon still. It was not a big still where your cut points are dead on. You know what I mean? It's not like 1,000 gallon still where you have, 200 gallons of hearts, right? Understand that. So these guys were honing their craft. Well, it wasn't until, these young whippersnapper kids of the settlers come in and they're like, oh, okay, they're doing a thing and this is kind of cool. Ergo Jack Daniels, right? Chapter 5, War and Whiskey. Yeah. This explores how the Civil War disrupted distilling across Tennessee. Well, as it would. Many distilleries were shuttered or destroyed, but whiskey remained in demand by soldiers and civilians. Post-war, distilling began to rebuild and shift towards commercialization. So, Civil War came. We all know what happened there. It was brother fighting brother, right? And so just because of a imaginary line, right? These people, and they use my words lightly here because I don't want to offend people. It was over owning slaves, supposedly. There was a lot more going on with it, and so it's not that the North or South, I don't remember which one wanted the slaves, right? It's not that they wanted the slaves, like they wanted the workers is what they wanted. If you take away the workers and if they're not enslaved to you, then you won't have people to work in your fields and work in your still house and all of that stuff. So they're feeding them, they're giving them room and board. I don't know if they're paying them, but you know what I mean? So like, it's not like that they just wanted the slaves because they wanted to beat them. Now that happened. Don't get me wrong. I'm not justifying slavery at all. Like, I don't want you to think I am at all. Like, it was horrible, the things that were done. But I think they were looking at it from a financial point more than a like, don't tell me what to do. And it could have been that as well. I don't know. I wasn't there, back then, but it totally destroyed a lot of these smaller distilleries in Tennessee that were these farm type distilleries. Because back then, here's the other thing, and it says this in the book, and I don't know if I'm moving too fast forward, but a lot of the whiskey that they had that they gave you a bottle of wasn't even named. It didn't have a label. It didn't have any marketing on it. You just knew that that's Jim Bob down the street. He's got some good liquor, so I'm gonna go get a bottle from him or fill up my thing from him. It wasn't, oh, that's George Dickel's whiskey. No, you didn't know whose it was, unless you got it directly from them. So, yeah. And then when it says post-war distillation began to rebuild and shift towards commercialization, then that's when the industrial part came through and they started industrializing and making the stills more efficient, using column stills and not pot stills, stuff like that. Pause. So there's that. So chapter 6 gets into the golden age. And this is really cool. This chapter is where it kind of turns. The first 5 chapters, we're talking about the old history and some names in there like the Shelby family, right? And make sure you listen to the podcast next week where we talk about the Shelby family for a second. I'm an idiot, so just understand that. It says, this describes the whiskey boom in Tennessee from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. Dozens of distilleries operated across the state, producing varieties of high-quality spirits. Branding and bottling began to emerge. See, I nailed it. I freaking nailed it, bro. It began to emerge as marketing tools. So when Jack Daniels came along, he was a marketer. You know what I mean? He could market his whiskey. And then they decided, hey, we need to find a label, put a label on this whiskey. And they would all were fighting for, these labels and stuff like that. It's actually pretty cool. Yeah. So that was a pretty cool chapter to go through. All right. Chapter 7, the government and grit. Anytime there's a boom, the government's going to get in there. This focused on the early regulations, taxes, and government attempts to control alcohol production. Many small producers were pushed out by the larger ones. We see it still today. More resources were more resourceful operations. Prohibition sediment began to build. So there was this quote unquote temperance movement. Sorry, 79 in here now, and the cooler's like blowing right on me. It's not helping. That's why I wanted to do this early. Anyway, so this temperance movement was going around because so back in the day, they would give children alcohol. They would make what they call a hot toddy for their kids. If they were feeling sick, they would literally make them a mixed drink. And I'm not saying that like your grandpa, or your grandma would like, I've heard this, I haven't done it myself, but I've heard like if your baby has a toothache, you get a little bit of whiskey and rub it on their gums. It acts as a, Oragel kind of thing. I mean, it's true. I've heard it. And I mean, I'm not saying give your baby a shot, right? But that's what they did. That's what the old timers, that's what they did. They knew that it could be used as medicine, right? And guess what? If you're not able to sleep, if you're not feeling good, you get a little bit of whiskey, some honey, stuff like that, and make it hot. Take a couple sips, go to bed. It'll help you sleep. And sleep is the best medicine for if you're not feeling well, right? Do I approve of underage drinking? Absolutely not. No, that's not what I'm talking about. But you have to think, like, all of these people used alcohol was in their life all day long. People today treat alcohol as a secondary item. That was something they used all the time. You know what I mean? It wasn't just not just indulging in it, but like they used it. Like you had a cut, you rubbed whiskey on it, right? You were sick, you took a shot of whiskey. You know, all the things. Like now, were they getting drunk and becoming dependent on it? Absolutely. And that's where they saw, and the doctors then that were over there, they saw some of the things that were happening, like, you know, because there's different people in the world, obviously, and some can hold their liquor, others can't, others partake way too much, and they get abusive or rowdy or start being destructive or whatever, and it hurts families, right? And they don't want that. They want these families to thrive. And so the doctors came in and they said, well, you know, alcohol is really not that good for you. And then there was a lot of religious people that came through, and they were like, yeah, it's not good. This devil juice, right? We don't want it. And then this kind of temperance movement got started, and people were on board with it. But what was happening, it was like angry. It was an angry temperance movement. It wasn't just like, hey, I don't partake, right? It was like they would go to these places and get their whiskey and just break it. For what, you know, and like raid places and protest and do all this. Okay, we have the right to protest, yes, but you know, just because you feel away doesn't mean everybody else does, right? Well, then the temperance movement got a little bit larger and a little bit larger because they made you feel bad, right? They made you feel bad for as the person that you are. So Chapter 8 gets into prohibition creeps in. Tennessee's early local and statewide prohibition efforts predated the national prohibition. Many distilleries closed, went underground, or moved operations elsewhere. So what they would do, they just picked up and moved to the other state. Yeah, why not? You don't want me to do it here? I'll go 20 miles that way and distill in Kentucky. Well, it wasn't Kentucky then, but you know what I mean. And then it begins to set up the devastation impact of the Volstead Act. So the Volstead Act, yeah, that's a big one. Now we're going to talk about that for a second. Hold on. All right, here is the Google Foo definition of the Volstead Act. It is officially known as the National Prohibition Act. It was a U.S. law passed in 1919 to enforce the 18th Amendment, which prohibits the manufacture, sale, transport of alcoholic beverages. It was named after the Congressman Andrew Volstead of Minnesota, who campaigned the legislation. It passed over a veto by Woodrow Wilson. It took effect on January 17th, 1920, marking the start of prohibition in the U.S. It defined intoxicating liquors as any beverage that contained more than 0.5 alcohol by volume, including beer and wine. It outlined penalty because for a while they were like, no, it's just hard liquor. We don't want you to drink hard liquor. You can still drink beer and wine. And what's funny is brandy, it really didn't get hit until this very last thing. People would drink brandy all the time. It was just the whiskey, which I thought was kind of weird, kind of strange. It outlined penalties for violations, allowed certain exceptions: medicinal alcohol, prescription, sacrament wine for religious purpose, and industrial alcohol with regulations. So like ethanol for whatever. It sparked a boom in illegal production, smuggling, and bootlegging, gave rise to speakeasies, which that's what we get into here. It organized crime, and notorious figures like Al Capone overwhelmed the law enforcement to control. Obviously, the Volstead Act was nullified by the 21st Amendment in 1933, which repealed the 18th Amendment. Pretty awesome. Pretty awesome stuff. Not really. But here's the deal. If we did not have the Volstead Act put into place, and had we not had this sordid past, because our past makes our future. It shapes our future, right? We are not our past. We are not our past transgressions, right? But it does shape the way that future makes, right? Like, let's say if you were, and not to get into this, but let's say that as a young child, you were abused, right? Physically, mentally, spiritually, however, and you take that scar, even though you might, in your older years, you became a young man or young woman, and you made some bad decisions. You made some bad decisions, drugs and alcohol or whatever, and you did, but then you straighten up and you go to therapy and you feel better. And you deal with those demons, as they say, right? But that stuff still happens, right? So it leaves a scar, not a physical one. Well, sometimes it does, but not a physical scar, but a scar. And that scar defines us and it strengthens us, and it forges us in fire, does it not? It forges us to be better, because I'm not going back to that place. Amen? So history in itself has forged America, and in this case, Tennessee whiskey, and in this case, world whiskey, and in this case, bourbon. It has really forged all of that. Some of the names that we read in this book, nobody's ever talked about besides Drew. Maybe they talked about him in 1892, but not now. How many people do you know that know the name Shelby, right? Yeah, you know Nearest Green because somebody talked about him. You know what I mean? And later on the next episode, where we will talk about Jack Daniels. I know that's what you came here for, but we will talk about Jack Daniels and his torrid legacy, we'll say. All right, so chapter 9, the dry years. Yeah, this chronicles the Prohibition era and how it nearly wiped out Tennessee whiskeys. Bootleggers surged, but legal operation almost vanished. Some brands survived by relocating or shifting to medicinal alcohol purposes. So, not saying anything, not going there, but that same thing almost happened in April 2020. It did. A lot of distilleries in America had to stop production, and they had to make hand sanitizer, which we now realized is not. Anyway, moving on. So it was a pro. Now, could you buy whiskey? Obviously, people sold whiskey more during the pandemic than they ever have, right? You can talk to anybody. They sold more whiskey online, of course, so you can get it shipped to your house. They opened up those shipping things. They made it in Texas. It's really hard to get alcohol delivered, which I don't know, it's weird. Whatever, that 3-tier stuff. They made it to where you could go to a restaurant and get like a margarita to go. I'm serious. I know there's a lot of states that's just normal. You can do that, but in Texas, we couldn't do it. Well, they passed a law or legislation or something like that you could do that. So it's not that people weren't drinking, just the distilleries, they weren't able to make product or put in barrels, right? They were having to make hand sanitizer. So that's very similar. It's not the same, but it's very similar to what was happening back then. Because if you have to shift to making one thing, you go from making sticky bourbons and now you're making, 90 proof freaking ethanol. I don't know. And the government told you to do it. That's prohibiting me making whiskey, right? It's similar. All right, chapter 10, and then we're going to get into some questions, okay? This is called Rebirth and Reinnovation. Nope, Reinvention. I don't know what I'm talking about. After Prohibition, only a few distilleries reopened. Yeah, because they didn't have the funds, obviously. Notably, Jack Daniels. And we will definitely get into that next time. Many brands and techniques were lost. They had, back then, they had 3-chamber stills. You guys don't even know about that. We're going to get into that too. It discusses on how the legacy of Tennessee whiskey was simplified by mythology and surviving names. So that's once after Prohibition. Sorry, my hand's right in the camera. My nose is running. After Prohibition, people, once they started opening distilleries again, they decided, hey, we need to go back to those old names, those old people that were making this really cool whiskey. Well, they made it a little different. They just did. They were putting it in barrels. And then I think we'll get into in the next couple of chapters where it was the bonding, right? The bottled and bond. And so they didn't have to pay taxes on it if it was sitting in a barrel. So, because what was happening even during Prohibition is they were taxing for every gallon of distillate that they made, but then they were also taxing to warehouse it, and they were taxing to sell it, and they were taxing this, and they were taxing you to distill. And so by the end of it, you had to pay hundreds of dollars back then, a month, a year, whatever, that you couldn't afford. When you're selling a fifth of whiskey for 7 cents or 8 cents, come on, man. Ain't no way that that's going to happen, right? So they just, yeah. Sorry, I got off topic, but and another cool thing, and then we'll get to the questions. Another cool thing that Drew talks about is he said he did not want to get so much into the whiskey lore, even though that is his podcast name, right? Whiskey Lore is his podcast. It's excellent. Go check it out, guys. Obviously, I'll have it linked down below. He didn't want to get into lore. He wanted more factual documentation. And I asked him in the podcast that you're going to listen to next, if he was like, well, I asked, newspapers lie, don't they? They're cited, because back then it was very, there was a Republican newspaper and then a Democratic newspaper, and these people were more dry and these people were more wet. You know what I mean? And so how do you know the news you're getting is the news that you should get, right? And that's even today, right? You have to be very open-minded and he goes, well, I went through historical records and stuff like that. Not so much newspaper. He did go through a lot of newspaper, but he would try to go through both sides and say, okay, they're both saying the same thing, so this is probably true. But of course, history is for the winner, right? They don't talk about the guy who died all the time. They say, oh, he died, but he was a murderer. So, all right. Let's do this. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and I'm going to answer them, but I also want to give you food for thought. Okay. I guess that's how we'll say it. We'll say it's food for thought. I kind of categorize this into different chapters because I feel like that's kind of how it is. Chapter 1 through 3 is called Setting the Stage, because I feel like it was, setting the stage. Okay. In this, I said, Hannush argues the history was selectively remembered. What do you think some of the distilleries or figures, why do you think some of the distilleries or figures were erased from public memories while others endured? Okay, so why were some just, you never heard of them again, or they weren't even in the book because he couldn't find them. He had heard tale, but he had no factual evidence of it. And he said that a couple of times in the book, like, I don't know, but this is what I think, but I'm not going to use what I think in this. I think, unfortunately, I think it has a lot to do with money. It has a lot to do with money and who you are and the clout that you have. You know what I mean? I think that has a lot to do with it. I don't know. What do y'all think? Okay, then the next question answered on chapters 1 through 3. The Lincoln County process is central to defining Tennessee whiskey. Do you think this process is enough to set it apart from bourbon, or is it more of a marketing distinction? This one. Okay. I feel like what they're doing, the fact that they're doing this charcoal mellowing, but what they do, which is different what some other people do, and Kentucky people do this as well, is they charcoal mellow before barreling. There are others that charcoal mellow after barreling before they bottle, because during the 70s, 80s, people did not want colored whiskey. They wanted clear spirits only, right? So they would charcoal mellow it to get the color out, but it still had flavor. Does that make sense? The wood would still impact flavor, but it wouldn't have any color, or very, very light color if it had color. I think it is it enough? Is it enough that they charcoal mellow? I don't know. Obviously, is it different? Yes. If you tried a Tennessee whiskey next to a Kentucky bourbon, they're going to taste different, even though the mash bills are fairly similar. So especially once they started using more and more corn, and we're getting into the industrial side of it, right? Where they're doing 80% corn, 15% rye, 12% malted barley. Like the whiskey is different. It definitely is different. But also distillation practice, the way that they're doing it, the water that they use, the yeast that they have, all of that plays a factor. And they talked at length, and I don't know if we're at that part yet. I get lost in the book, actually, where they were talking about yeast strains and how sour mash and sweet mash were a big thing. I'm not going to go too far into that because that might be playing ahead, but yeah. So I think it does it delineate it enough. I think so, but just barely, because it has all the components of a bourbon, correct? The charcoal mellowing and it being distilled in Tennessee makes it enough to be a Tennessee whiskey, right? It makes it enough. And so them trying to do it the way that they used to do it, the way that they started doing it, the leaching process that they started to do, I think that is paying homage to their legacy. Not just that distillery's legacy, but the legacy of Tennessee whiskey. And so I do think it's enough. Yeah, I think it is enough. I worked myself into that one. Good. All right, chapters 4 and 5. This is Hidden Hands and Hard Times. What are your thoughts on the role of enslaved individuals shaping Texas whiskeys, especially figures like Nearest Green? Well, I've touched on this already. I think they did it as a job, but then here's the thing. Servants, slaves, whatever you want to call them, if they, if they're treated right, then they will work better for you, correct? But at the same time, they had no choice. The choice wasn't theirs. Now, Nearest, from what I heard, was an excellent distiller, and they needed him. They needed him to create this spirit, because when somebody else tried, it wasn't as good. So his spirit, there was a reason. The way that he made it was better. So, I mean, I don't like that part of whiskey in general, because it was not just Tennessee whiskey. It was all over, where you would have enslaved people. But the thing that, again, that they don't talk about is a lot of the distillers back pre-Prohibition were women, because that was part of their work at the house or at the mercantile when they were working. You know what I mean? The man was out, cutting the meat or whatever, plowing or whatever, and the woman would take whatever leftover grain and distill it, and did an excellent job at it. So I think Drew said he's working on another passage or another book where he's talking about women of whiskey, which is difficult because he can't find a whole lot of stuff. And then, should there be more formal recognition or reparative action? If you can find it. I mean, I feel like anybody in history that was doing cool things, they need to be held up and said, hey, you did a really cool thing. either a legacy for their family or whatever. Yeah, I feel like they need to be talked about, even if it is hard to talk about. You know what I mean? Because some of those years were not great. But like I say, our ego is not our amigo. You know. All right. The Civil War nearly stopped whiskey production. How do you think the war changed the trajectory of Tennessee whiskey in the long term? Well, for me, I feel that when you are to the brink of shutting down and you're like, done, I'm done with this. I can't do this anymore. Or, you know, they're killing your kids or whatever. Sorry, I had to have a drink. I get to talking, you know. When they're putting direct issue to your livelihood, it changes you in good and bad ways, right? So it definitely shaped it, because when you're fighting brother on brother, especially in like a civil war, there's a hair or something in my nose, especially in the Civil War, like that was such a difficult thing for somebody to do, you know, to be on the other line and see possibly your brother or your uncle over there and you got to kill him. That's a big deal. That shapes the world. That shaped the United States and the world. I feel like it shaped the world as well. So it has a definite impact. Now, what impact? I don't know. It made people a little more humanitarian, maybe. You know, love thy neighbor type thing. I don't know. Chapters 6 and 8, the rise and fall. During the Golden Age, whiskey was booming. What factors contributed to that growth, and which of those are missing in today's craft scene? That's a hard one, because back then when it was booming because of reputation. Yeah. And there are so many distilleries out right now. A lot of distilleries. And NDPs and all of these things doing whiskey, right? And they have this, oh man, I'm not trying to be harsh. They have this copy-paste history, right? Oh, this is a proprietary blend of 7 herbs and spices and blah, 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 blah. It's the same thing that guy has. You're sourcing NGP and putting it in a bottle. Like, come on. That's what's missing in today's scene. Now, there are distilleries out there that are kicking ass. Yes, absolutely. That are showcasing their heritage and branding a new heritage and becoming like, hey, we don't really have a heritage. My day job sucked and I wanted to do this, and I'm creating some killer whiskey. But I'm also giving a nod back to the people of old, because they did it best. One of the greatest examples of that is Alan Bishop. Alan Bishop is at Old Homestead. He is recreating, pre-prohibition style whiskeys and brandies and cordials and moonshines and all of these things, because he's like, that's what they did. They used what they had. And he goes through these, just like Drew, he goes through these archives and he finds these old distilling recipes and he's like, oh crap, I got to make that. That is innovation. Okay. How does the early government intervention, taxes, regulations, prohibition, shape which distilleries survived? Do you see any modern parallels? Well, that's exactly what I was talking about with COVID, right? It was the same. I feel it was okay. Was it a prohibition? No, it wasn't, but it was something. I feel, and this is just me because I am that type of person. I feel that, watch my words. I feel that government intervention is a thing, and they do their thing, and they need their money. I get that. But there becomes a line where it becomes bullying as well, correct? to where when you're taxing me on something that I've already been taxed on 3 times, how is that fair to me? Why not just say, hey, it's going to be a 15% tax instead of 5%, 5%, 5%? You're trying to make it sound less, but it's actually more. Does that make sense? Because not only that tax, you make me fill out other documents and all of these things. And if I don't have everything tip top, you come in and shut my company down. That's like, we're out here struggling, trying to do the thing that you're telling us to do. And then you don't even look at the thing, right? You don't even look at it. You're just like, oh, you didn't get this notarized, so you go to jail or whatever. You know what I mean? I'm sorry. There is big modern parallels with it as well. It shaped the distilleries because they were like, we don't want that, but we have it. It's a necessary evil, unfortunately. All right, chapters 9 and 10. The loss and revival. After Prohibition, most distilleries didn't return. What do you think was lost when smaller regional whiskey makers disappeared? Funds. I feel like it was funds. They didn't have the money. And they were probably moonshining. And the revenue guys came, caught them, and destroyed their stills, destroyed their families, destroyed their lives. And these guys are like, I'm not going to risk it for the biscuit. You know what I mean? I'm not going to risk. I'll do something else. I'll just do something else. I feel. Is it possible to fully reclaim a lost whiskey heritage, or are some things just permanently gone? That's a hard question. That's a hard question because can you revive an old brand? Yeah, people do it all the time. Nelson Greenbrier, right? Old brand got revived. But is it the same? Is it better? I don't know because I didn't try the turn of the century spirit, right? Comparatively. But can you revive history and use it to teach people today? I think so. Is it the same? No, it's not going to be the same because, man, I'm not trying to poo-poo America or poo-poo people, but people don't have the same. Some do. I'm not hashtag not all people. People don't have the same drive and initiative because this isn't life or death, right? Back then, having a distillery meant they had a profit to go buy food, right? That's how they were back then. They were surviving. Yeah, they made whiskey too, but they were surviving. Nowadays, whiskey is a luxury, not a necessity. And that's where the heart and the drive doesn't get put in it. Are there distillers, head distillers, master distillers, people that work at distilleries that really truly care? Absolutely. I'm not saying anything about those guys. But are there marketing campaigns and are there brand ambassadors that could give a crap less about what's in the glass? Absolutely. And that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. It is different. The landscape is different. It's all about selling now. It's not so much about what's in the glass or what's in the bottle or the story behind it. And that's what I know Drew as well with his podcast, that's what we try to get to the bottom of, is the story behind the glass. Right? Understand that. All right. What role do modern distillers play in this effort? Well, like I was saying with Alan Bishop, right? People going back and looking at these old recipes and recreating them. Yeah, they're not going to be the same, but they're cool. They're different. People using heirloom grains and these old recipes. And like it makes me think of Iron Root and Balcones. They're using this old blue corn recipes and stuff like that. Super cool. Then there's so many others. Like I those are the ones that just came off the top of my head. But like so many people are innovating and they're trying new things and they're going with these older style recipes. And they're like, why did they put oats in there? Oh, well, because they were drinking it neat or unaged. And the oats gave it a smoother mouthfeel. It wasn't for flavor. Well, it was for flavor, but you know what I mean? It wasn't because they ran out of wheat or whatever. It was because they used it because it made the profile a little bit softer to where it wasn't as harsh, right? And people didn't understand that. They're like, oh, they must have ran out. No, they didn't run out. Well, maybe the first time, the first time they made it. And then when they drank it, they were like, holy crap, that's pretty good. We should do that again. Let's recreate that again. And I think that's what we all do. We're all innovating to be just like we were back in the day. Because there's nothing new under the sun. Somebody's already done it. Right? So, yeah. I don't know. What do y'all think? What do y'all think about these first 10 chapters? It's a lot of history. It's a lot of going way back. In the next section, we will finish the book. I'm not going to do three sections, so it'll be a little longer. But we will get into more modern day. We will get into some brands you've heard of, and it'll be really cool. I enjoyed this. I don't know if you guys did. If you did, let me know. If you didn't, let me know. But you won't because you didn't before. So I'm just talking and you're listening. So that's fine too. If you don't want to comment, that's fine. I'll just continue to do what I want to do because I want to do it. But this is an open forum and I want people to comment and respond. If you don't do it on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, whatever, do it on my Instagram. Send me a private message, whiskeyshamancpodcast@gmail.com. Shoot me an email. Let me know. Just let me know how you feel about not only this episode, but the episodes before. And if there's anything I need to work on or any guests you want me to get on or whatever, like I want the feedback because I don't want to be stale. I don't want to be stagnant. I don't want to be producing content that nobody wants to hear besides myself. Does that make sense? So in saying all that, I thoroughly enjoyed this. I thought this was a lot of fun. It is like this book is wordy. I will say it's wordy, but if you can get into it and really dive into it and put yourself in that place, it's really magical. The way that Drew prefaces some of these things to where he goes off on a tangent a little bit about something. You're like, what does that have to do with, this person, stealing a still from somebody when he's talking about somebody's shoes or something, like he does these, but then he like circles back. And next thing you know, that same guy's in the same conversation a month later, wearing these shoes that just so happened to be the guy that stole the still. You know what I mean? Like, so the way that he programs it and puts it on the paper, it really shows an expertise in what he does. And I'm not just blowing smoke up his ass. I'm not, I promise. I can't thank him enough for allowing to come on here and just hang out with me. And I told him I was going to, do the book club, and he goes, don't hold back. So I'm not holding back. I mean, so far it's been great. But we'll see what happens getting further into the book. This took me a while, obviously, to get all this, synopsis, cliff notes, whatever you want to call them. Just so if you haven't read the book, I can kind of give you an update of like, hey, this is where we're at. Because history is just history. You can go back and read chapter 2 again. It's not going to change chapter 12, right? It might. The name might ring a bell or something like that. But anyway, I say all that to say this. Y'all be good. Again, Memorial Day. Say a quick prayer for all the fallen, because we probably wouldn't be here had they not put down their life. So, all right, y'all be good. Drink water. It's getting hot, guys. So just drink water and stay tuned for the podcast with Drew is next, and then we'll do part 2 or final chapter, the final reckoning, whatever you want to call it. And then we'll move on to bigger and better things. Well, not bigger. It won't be bigger. Maybe not even better. Y'all be good. And until next time, keep your